Hey everybody, welcome back to Xi4P Podcast, the show where we take a look at comics, mutants, magic, and marvels week after week through their many monthly titles. I'm Nico, and you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at NicoAction. That's NicoAction.
And I'm Arturo, Mr. Toybox on Twitter and Instagram.
I'm Josh Will. You can find me at Asleep at the Wheel, WEIL on Twitter, and asleepatthewheel.com. And for the next 2 years as the Progressive Democrat running for U.S. Senate in the state of Florida, you can find me across social media at Wheel, the number 4, U.S. Senate, and at joshwheel.org.
And I'm so excited to have these two particular gentlemen with me because what we are talking about today is a story, however many canceled years since the original X Factor in the making, which is X-Men Legends numbers 5 and 6 by the incredible team of Peter David, Todd Nauck, and Michelle Rosenberg. And I say the colorist on this one because it really fucking matters. Right now, before we get into all of the exquisite ways Michelle Rosenberg transported me to a color spectrum I had forgotten was viscerally impactful on the way I interpret comics, because holy shit, we're gonna, I can't. But what I can is I need to know, how do you guys feel about classic Pad X Factor? And I mean Quesada, Strowman, and all.
So I'm a fan. I'm a fan of a lot of Peter David stuff. I've met Peter David a couple times, had some really nice conversations with him. I genuinely like him as a person. We mentioned this in a recent episode. I think that Peter David kind of takes a little extra shit because he swings and misses a bunch. Because, and especially in the 90s, early 2000s, we're talking about someone in a white cishet male dominant, like not like we say it is now, but like just a completely across the board landscape.
Just a straight white massacre.
And he was the one willing to kind of step out of that comfort zone, out of his wheelhouse, and try to tell these stories that were not any other writer's stories. Like there was no one in there who, now there were people who could, but they were not being hired. There was no one in the bullpen at Marvel and DC who could tell these stories. And most of them wouldn't and didn't want to or care to. So he stepped out and, he tried telling stories about trans characters and Middle Eastern characters. And, he's gone across the spectrum to different races, ethnicities, gender, sexualities, and really tried. But it's not him, and he doesn't have that voice. And he gets knocked for that a lot. But I think that he, no pun intended, since that's the name of our artist today, he should get some credit, one, because he is well-intentioned on this. He means well in what he's genuinely a good dude, I believe, in my experience of having met him. And he was reaching out and giving representation, when it didn't exist and wasn't accessible from creators, represented creators. So I'm a big fan. Having said that, I know that as someone who loves a lot of his runs, like his Aquaman run, his Supergirl run, his X Factor run, that they are enjoyable when reading them, but often a lot of the flaws are easily noticeable when you start trying to explain to someone what's happening. Like if you just sit back and try explaining to someone what was going on in his Aquaman one, you make it even harder to try to convince them that, like, no, this was a really great Aquaman run. Like you get to the point where they're like, no, Atlantis is one of 7 different alien Atlantises across like space. And, and they're flying up in spaceships and people are like, what? And you're like, yeah. And then like, he's going through a midlife crisis. So, he starts sleeping with this like questionably young girl who then marries Aqualad. Like, and it just gets, and you're like, no, I swear it's good though. Like,
that's actually how I feel about Whedon's Astonishing. When you're like, okay, but it all happens in 3 days. It's just like one day and then the next day and then like 2 days, 6 months later. And they kind of pretend that nothing else ever happens. and people are still stunted 6 months later, even though they've clearly gotten past it. But trust me, it's good. You kind of wind up in that, like, it's a run,
with me,
not a canon
Like
thing.
I gotta just say, like, I love the classic Peter David X Factor. That to me was such an important book when it was coming out. That was, again, to pull up the, nostalgia card, like that's when I was reading comics as a kid. I was reading that, going to the comic shop every week. And Peter David's X Factor was so different from everything else in the line. Like there had just been the huge, X-Men reset where classic X Factor team moved back into the mansion, and there was this whole new team and Val Cooper, and it was so just different and clever. And I agree that like a lot of the jokes maybe don't hold up. Some of the cultural references are definitely going to be lost on new readers that are going back and exploring this on Marvel Unlimited or what have you. But at the time, it just felt just smart and just different. And I think that's kind of like where I started developing like a love for, procedural slash government, muckety muck kind of content, that turned into eventually like loving like West Wing and Veep and whatever else. Like there were threads of that back in X Factor that just spoke to me in a weird way, where there was this team that was assembled with the best of intentions. And it was really when I truly fell in love with Havoc and Polaris and these characters that had been so B-list. Nobody really loved them back then. Like you liked them maybe, but they were always more potential than actual stories. And then Peter David came and he brought all of this potential to life. And not all of it is great, but it was at least interesting and great. So I really enjoyed this revisit. And then there was the other Peter David run, right? When it was X Factor Investigations. And like that was coming out at a point where I had gone out of comics and then kind of was weaving back in, and I was kind of like testing the waters or whatever, but I wasn't like a weekly reader. And again, Peter David just came back and did something very different. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that the guy always has a different take on what's going on. He's trying to give you something that's not just X-Men light or X-Force light. He does
Yeah.
he gives it a
he
twist.
was doing character work in this book before the other books of the time did, because we think of all the character work done on the New Mutant characters growing up and what happened to them in X-Force, but that was not in the early Nicieza run. Like that came after in the Jeff Loeb and then the Moore run that followed. So he did do, and honestly, I want to kind of bring up, and this is something Nico recommended to me a while back, but I had picked up the gallery edition of God Loves Man Kills, the extended cut, which, by the way, is just a gorgeous presentation and a fantastic buy. And Claremont has a modern kind of little editor's note in the back, where he talks about that there are two changes he made from when this was first written until this current 2020 extended cut. And he says that one of them was removed completely. The other one was left in, but, he redacted a word that, he wouldn't print today. And he explained the difference. And he said, that, both of these were fine. These weren't even things that he caught criticism or question on until for like 15, 20 years, at least after they were written. Like in the time, they were not even questionable. As 40 years has passed, he says one of them is at a point where it's understandable for the character and makes sense. Like it makes sense where it is, even if it's not appropriate to be printed. The other one, he says now, like clearly is way off in terms of what it implies culturally, and just the panel has to be removed. And to say that, like as time passes, there are ways to, our opinions on some of these things change, and not always the same. It's not always in or out. That there could be like I don't like this, but that doesn't mean that it's not honest or real or okay, the character could have done a bad.
It's the Neil Gaiman thing
Um,
that just happened about A Game of You, where people tried to come for Neil Gaiman and called him super turfy over stuff that happens in A Game of You. And he was like,
And it's such a misreading of the goddamn text. It's just
fuck.
like you're
Yeah.
missing the whole fucking point.
He's like, that's a bad person in that story having a bad opinion. What are
Yes.
you missing? And
It couldn't be more clear. Oh my God. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No.
I get
It's that
pissed.
level
I'm very
of
protective of Neil
shared
Gaiman.
aneurysm.
Yeah.
So looking back on some of these too, just to say that maybe there was some tone deafism, because there is. And when we go to when this story takes place in between 75 and 76.
Right.
Which 75 is the end of the first arc of Peter David's X Factor, which has, the multiple mans and the question of who the real one is, and really just a bunch of meddling from Sinister, who's only getting involved in fucking around with things to, remind Alex who his daddy
The
is.
Nasty Boys. We got the Nasty Boys. This is like right before Executioner's song then?
Like a bit before.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
The very next thing is a crossover with Peter David's Hulk. So
which
in
is
between 75
so
and 76, readers would have had to have read Hulk 391. And then it's a crossover that involves the Pantheon, which are some weird kind of forgettable characters that whatever from the Hulk run. And and it's an issue that's most remembered because it takes place in this, I have the name of it here, Transabal, which essentially I think was probably supposed to be Iraq, but as people who aren't familiar with the Middle East just tend to Middle East cross things up, is really more representative of kind of Yemen, dealing with Saudi area. So much more of like a Yemeni conflict from Saudi above, but it's dealing with Middle Eastern conflicts and kind of humanizing and putting these characters in a situation where it makes it real, most of all, and the most impacted being Rain. And this is one that I remember being super impactful before and later reads. And then, so later reads as like 21st century adult Josh reading. Then post 2018, having spent a year living in the Middle East, Josh reading. Very different. Like it is, and again, I go back to the kind of well-intentioned and how much do I love humanizing Middle Eastern characters, demonstrating the horrors of the war-torn state there in the 90s. Like, because that shit only got harder starting September 12th, 2001. Like, it was a big freaking deal when we got a Arab descent Muslim character from Detroit being the star of Green Lantern Zero in 2012, 2013, more than a decade after 9/11. Like, we were so far away from getting this for a long time. Soraya Qadir comes into mind, but another character who's, and I've mentioned on this podcast before, like the Middle Eastern ethnicity mingling of like, she's Afghani, but her plight is kind of Syrian and her dress is definitely like Gulf Coast Khaliji, because, Middle East, well-intentioned, but nowhere near the authenticity you get from like a G. Willow Wilson Miss Marvel, which I would say definitely is the first like, holy shit, we can have nice things for, and not Arab per se, because South Asian, but for brown Middle Eastern Muslim characters. So like there's a lot here and there's a lot of feelings, and this is where this story takes place in between those two, which I have some thoughts on as well. But
well, and it's interesting that you bring up what was the name of the place you just said?
Transabal.
So, I was just recently having this conversation about fictional territories in comics that turn out to be kind of like a muddy collection of cliches and stereotypes. And I will say I prefer a fictional land to actually like, let's go to an actual place and misrepresent it. And I'm bringing this up simply because like you were talking about Transabal, meanwhile, back in the 80s, I remember in a Generation 1 Transformers cartoon, there was the fictional land of, I kid you not, Carbamia, which is pretty bad. In a whole place where this whole universe about transforming cars, they made a country called Carbamia. So that exists. So sometimes it is not good. Sometimes it is terrible. But I think it is worth pointing out that in Marvel Comics, Latveria is such a place, right? And I appreciate that.
Madripoor, so we're not constantly saying evil, shady Shanghai streets, which not great.
Wakanda.
Right, Wakanda, yeah.
Krakoa.
Yes, all of these are Terra Verde, right? All of these are good examples. Latveria specifically, and I think we need to kind of address, the big elephant in the room when it comes to Peter David, and separated from his great work in comics is obviously his controversial and straight up, racist and a very unfortunate remarks about Romani people.
I was literally
and I
in
know
the
that
room.
For some people, that is a deal breaker, and they're like, I am not going to read anything else.
It was
Oh my
the
God,
worst day. It was the worst, most awkward, horrifying day at a convention. Everywhere you went, someone went.
It must have just kept getting worse.
Yeah.
As he kept talking about it.
And then
you're like,
after you walk out, they're like, "Did you hear what Peter David said?" And I'm like, "Yes, I was in the room. I'd like to just keep walking." And everybody, did you? He called all Romani people monsters that beat their children. And I'm like, not what happened, but what he did was not much better. And it just kept going like that, and it was horrifying. It happened at a New York Comic Con. It was a nightmare.
So in that context, I just want to take a step back from the X factor of it all and just point out it's a little kind of awkward that, yes, this isn't a story about the Romani people, but the fact that it's the Latvians kind of, I've seen reads on Twitter that are like, wow, who let Peter David near this? And, I'm not going to defend it, but I will just say it's kind of like, maybe we could have done with something just a little bit different. But anyways, but again, even with that awkwardness, I think he does strive to tell a story about kind of, the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters and the oppressed people. And, so it's not a bad story, but there are awkward tones in it.
It gets a little touchy for sure. And just to give people a little background on what we've been talking about, the original Peter David run started in X Factor number 70. X Factor number 70, Day of Judgment, serves as a transition issue between the, we'll say it, exiting regime and the new regime of the sort of Lobdell, Nicieza, Claremont's there for 3 issues and then gets out of there. But Lee is still there, so don't worry. He's only there for 11 issues and then he gets out. Things are getting mucky, right? But
and
so
let's also point into that is kind of the epilogue final issue
of Muir Island
Saga, and really the last issue pre Jim Lee's Uncanny 281 and Jim Lee's X-Men #1.
Yeah, and that's the point. Yeah, it's a transition issue.
Yes, it was supposed to be a Chris Claremont wrapping up the end, but he kind of took his basketball and went home a little early, and so Peter David, who was going to be the next, got to do an early ramp up in, and it's a very interesting historical artifact transition comic between 2 eras.
Well, and I do want to point out that there is a lot of interesting discussion about who was writing what, when, and why. So Claremont came in because they felt
throughout all of the Muir Island Saga.
Oh, and the leading up to it, Claremont comes in after Weezy leaves X Factor to assist Whilce Portacio on scripting because Whilce has cool ideas, but he's not a scripter. So Claremont comes in and writes out Baby Cable, a character that he's had miraculously little to do with, all considering the last 5 years at Marvel. And then he's told
phenomenal 4 issues.
Yeah.
Titled Endgame.
According to Claremont, he's told he cannot write both books. He is not so much told, oh, he's gonna leave Uncanny a little early. He's told, no, you need to get started on X-Men numbers 1 through 3. That has to be going already. So the way he paints it, it was taken from him and Nicieza walked into the right office at the right time and was given the opportunity to run the ball. It sort of kind of happened that then they were like, you just want to keep writing it, I guess. And so he just sort of kept writing it. Peter David's inclusion is so fascinating because I don't always know that what Peter David contributes is necessary. I think Peter David is currently doing Symbiote Spider-Man, which takes place during the Symbiote Spider-Man era. And now he's doing this. So he just keeps doing books that take place 20 and 30 years ago.
Right.
Because Peter David's always the outside guy. He just knows where the bodies are buried. So no one's going to fire him.
They're giving him the thanks grandpa paycheck
that Claremont got.
Yeah. Like we've seen this before. We've seen this with hell. It led to the resurgence of Dan Jurgens' career. He was getting thanks grandpa paychecks, and then he did a really fucking good on Lois and Clark after Convergence, and he wound up back on big boy titles again. But no, we've seen it with DeMatteis and Griffin.
Speaking of DeMatteis, the guy who takes over when Pad leaves.
Well,
with Lobdell.
Yeah.
And then by himself.
Lobdell jumping in and parasiting his way into big writings. But
that's Lobdell.
Also worth noticing, this is the pre-Image era where the Marvel method started getting turned upside down, because the Marvel method of the writer writes the plot, the artist panels it out, and then the writer comes back and scripts it. The artists, who had started becoming bigger names than many of the writers, were demanding to be able to do the plot as well. And then that was getting to the writers for scripting, and particularly our image artists on a lot of these, like Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, and Willis was another one, were ones who, were flipping that in a way that we know was not like super comfortable for Claremont, although he was a part of it, and definitely was part of the rolling writer cycle turmoil in this period in the Marvel office.
I love that period of time, that turmoil, and I feel like then we might want to start issue 5 or 6, unless you guys have more to add. I certainly don't want to cut anybody off. But my last thing before I'm ready for the issues, because we just have too good a time talking to each other, is John Byrne was asked about his inclusion in that era. And
speaking of garbage people from the 90s.
Exactly. Who can't stop doing the same thing. He was asked what it was like working on those 3 or 4 issues of X-Men he ultimately did before leaving. And he said, it was legitimately harder than working with Chris Claremont. And that's just my favorite thing I've ever heard, because that's ridiculous. So
it's also really interesting to compare, and this is something that Jay and Miles have pointed out in their early episodes when talking about the Claremont era going from Cockrum to Byrne, is that, much of the emergence of Wolverine as a major character was because Byrne liked him better. And
Cockrum hated
following that Marvel method, where, Claremont was giving the plot synopsis, Byrne plots it out, Wolverine winds up getting more lines because Byrne is featuring him in more panels and front and center over other characters, whereas Nightcrawler had been getting more dialogue previously because Cockrum liked drawing him as a more featured character in the panels. So, that it's so wild to think, compared to the way that scripts, how meticulously we expect scripts to be written for in certain lines today, that like this character was in the background. That was clearly something that this writer planned and meant to do for something coming 7 issues in the versus before, where it was like, well, Wolverine had a lot of speaking points because the artist decided to draw him more. So then he just became the bigger fucking character. Is wild to think about.
I was talking with one of my editors, and they said, so I like a lot of this dialogue, but I feel like, the artist that you're working with draws a little big. So you are ready to throw out all of this dialogue and make it shorter, right? And I was just like,
we can't afford Tom Morzakowski. You're going to need to write less.
Well, and also accessibility concerns.
Bring back big Claremontian blocks of text, please.
That would not have been possible without Tom Morzakowski being the magician able to fit that shit in.
I will say one thing, before we even jump into the issue, progressively, I am enjoying X-Men Legends more and more. I think it's nice that there's a sandbox for these creators, and I also feel like X-Men Legends is kind of like targeted at exactly us. This like, you know, demo that kind of grew up with it and is still really actively into it now, or has come back to. It hits all those nostalgia feels, and you know, I'll just say it. I kind of like these guys playing in their own old sandbox where they're more comfortable doing their things than, hey, let's give Peter David a book in the Krakoan era. I don't think I need that. Like, I don't think I need that. I don't think I need what, you know, Walt Simonson's fresh take on, you know, like, I'm enjoying X-Men Legends, and I think it's great, like, that these, you know, these creators are getting, you know, a shot to tell more stories. I love the premise of it, you know, tying things up. I love that they insert, you know, reference numbers for like which issue this is happening between. I think those are great guardrails for these creative teams to play in.
Well, then we'll see how you respond to the rumored upcoming Claremont Gambit solo.
You're fucking with me.
I'm not. There's a rumor circling
and it's
around.
happening like now, like it'll be
But
like
does
in
it
the
take
Krakoan
place?
era?
Okay, so he
That's
can
the
have
rumor.
a
If it takes
solo,
place in the
but does it
Krakoan
take
era, I
place
am there.
now,
It
or
is
does it take place
that
in
is the
between
rumor.
like
The rumor is that it
Uncanny
is
X-Men 265 and 266?
it is like present right now. It is not an X-Men Legends. The rumor
I'm
is
so
Claremont
excited.
is
Fuck
coming
yourself.
back out of story retirement to write a Gambit solo book. This is interesting
Bend over and fuck
because
yourself.
his last thing was the Nightcrawler solo book that was
Not
by Todd
bad.
Knock.
And with Todd Knock art.
Yeah.
Wait,
like
was that when like Nightcrawler was in heaven and they had to, was that
Well,
that?
he was
No, that's
only
Jason
in
Aaron's
heaven.
Astonishing X-Men.
Yeah, that was just Astonishing X-Men 1 through 5. He comes back. He's in 6. Aaron leaves between 6 and 7. 7 is the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends or Alpha Flight issue. I don't remember. But then after 6, Nightcrawler goes over to his solo series by Claremont, and it's the resolution of his Crimson Pirates story.
Oh God.
So it's actually really cute. It's really good. It ties into Death of Wolverine, which as an event was okay, but as a celebration of a character by exploring the character's shadow and vacuum was a really interesting way to play against type. I think if you can tell a good story about a character without showing them, you've done a really good job. There's that sequence in that issue of Marauders that will always perhaps be the best Bishop ever, where Bishop threatens that the lightning is Storm. And so all of the pirates turn themselves in because they're afraid that that lightning really could be Storm. What a great Storm story without ever showing her. And I feel like Death of Wolverine kind of did that. So the Nightcrawler issues of that are good, but it is a pretty forgettable
Mystery and Mad Report
2013 solo
in the
series.
In the same vein, Mystery and Mad Report, which I think was the best of the hunt for Wolverines.
Yeah.
Also.
For sure. Sure.
I mean, listen, who knows? I'm here for it because Claremont's great. He doesn't always, you know, especially latter day Claremont, I know is not always like the right, you know, the right stuff, but I'd be curious to see what he does with Gambit. And hey, who knows? We might end up with Gambit with tentacles, you guys. Gambit might end up with tentacles.
It's been 50 years since he started X-Men. Like latter day Claremont starts 30 years ago. There's latter day and then there's because
post existence.
Hard to think about this. Like Jim Lee's X-Men #1 is closer to Stan Lee's X-Men #1 than it is Jerry Duggan's X-Men #1.
All right, I'm out of here. Bye, guys.
Yeah, the Sandman, seriously, the Sandman by Gaiman is closer to the Silver Age than the Sandman TV show is to the Sandman.
Okay, so now I feel like that meme, I guess I'll die now.
Yes.
Because
well, if we're all ready to die now, then
time is a flat circle.
It's time to become Legends. And I think there's no better transition than into X-Men Legends 5 and 6. Now we've kind of
I do want to give a little meta comment. So on the series as a whole, before we go, and once we turn into the issues, it's going to be on the issues. So I think that this line has done a fantastic job of matching current artists whose style and tone really match the feel of the original series.
Oh,
if
for
not
sure. That young
necessarily.
up and coming guy, Walt Simonson. I'm really glad they pulled that guy out of obscurity for numbers 3 and 4.
I hate you so much. I hate you so much. I meant I was talking more Todd Knock than Brett.
No, I agree. I totally agree. I was being silly. I'm sorry.
Yes. And that young whippersnapper, Walt Simonson. So
I'm sorry that I said I counted Walt Simonson as a writer. Obviously, it should have been Wheezy. Walt was on art in the previous issue. So
but they're so
self-correcting.
merged. They're so together on that.
And I love it. I love that little storyline too. That was fun. Anyway, sorry, Josh.
So I'm happy this exists. When we first started this and we were talking about X-Men Legends 1 and 2, we made the comparison to DC's Retroactive, which is something that they did in around the time of Flashpoint and the launch of New 52, giving writers from each era chances to go back and tell kind of untold stories. So bringing creative teams back and letting them, get you like a one last new Flash from the 70s story, one last new Green Lantern from the 90s story, Superman from the 90s.
Which Perez and Wolfman are so good at.
The 90s ones were the ones that I, gravitated towards, obviously, because I'm me. But no, like, it's exciting to get a Teen Titans like new, similar to the Claremont Sienkiewicz New Mutants War Children that they did a couple years back. Like getting a Perez Wolfman Teen Titans from the 80s one shot was and so these were nice, but specifically inconsequential, right? Specifically, like they would do nothing to change anything or be like, there's a reason why these stories didn't need to be told before. Like they had to be low stakes, and you're just grateful that like, oh, it's like I found an issue that I didn't read from 94 and I get one more new comic from them. I had higher expectations for this. We were kind of promised on this series that it was going to be writers who, didn't get to finish their runs, had kind of stories that they were setting up and never got to finish. And they totally delivered with Nicieza and the Adam Mech story in 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Since then, we've gotten the Simonson X Factor story and the Peter David X Factor story that have felt very much like those DC retroactives. You didn't miss anything, but here's a new one from the creator, which is more disappointing for me on this because of the way Peter David left X Factor. Peter David left, and he did get a chance in his X Factor investigations to go back and, obviously deal with characters and type some other things, but
and like poke things.
Left.
Go back and, make sure Rain is homophobic.
He left. I mean, I love her, but like she kind of,
but she's the
could
worst.
Be like she's mutant phobic.
The
and
worst.
She's a mutant. Like Reverend Craig fucked that girl up.
I didn't think that anything we did would matter. Wolf noise. That's all she ever says.
I was happy to see Reverend Craig pop up in his.
I was hoping that we were going
state.
to get something kind of from his near the end where Lobdell kind of just spun off and was like, fuck whatever Peter David was working on. We're going to go in this new direction. And then,
except I'm going to keep random.
So yeah, like I was really hoping for more of that. Like, okay, great. Like if you're telling me Peter David's coming back for a book that's being delivered on this promise to go tell a story from that era where he left with threads, I was thinking we were going to get that the way we did with Nicieza and Adam X. And the fact that we got a DC retroactive style story of ill consequence is a little disappointing to me.
Well, and like, I don't want to delay the discussion significantly longer, but I can't help it because I actually reread the other Legends before reading this one because I wanted to be super sharp on it. And one of the things that I found was kind of exactly what you're saying. I even felt that they sort of kind of tried to skirt the fact of the truth, which was they did do a big thing, but they kind of did a big thing badly. They gave us the identity of the third Summers brother, bumping Vulcan up to the fourth Summers brother with the possibility of a fifth Summers brother anytime we need it. But they took all of our memories of it away in a way that was sort of saccharine. You said this story was going to matter. They even kind of said, no alternate universes, no mind wipes. Like they even kind of said this will matter. And then
They
at the
made
end,
it till issue 2 without going back on that promise.
and then, I actually do
Wait,
think
but
that
with the Simonsons, we got a little more, Hodge Apocalypse interaction. That was cool.
that's what I was going to say. I liked 3
I'm
and
there
4
for
more
that.
than 1 and 2. For
Yeah,
sure.
I agree with that. I agree with that. One and two, I thought was one and two. I was really annoyed with at the time because it was like, okay, yeah, we're getting Adam X, but like, you're not even going to mention the possibility of Vulcan or like what I. One and two did what was promised. I just didn't enjoy it.
Vulcan was in the family tree at the end. We got a data page.
And they said brothers.
Yes, I did appreciate the data page. You're right. He was included.
Let's weigh these on a scale though, because this was part of our conversation of X-Men Legends 2 at the time. So now, we're a couple months past. Consequences with mind wipe versus no consequences, no mind wipe. Because the mind wipe, look, even if they don't want to do that, the more consequential you make what you go back and tell, you have to either hide it from every character or have them mind wiped in order for it to not fuck up 30 years of stories after.
I've got it.
Right.
I've got it. And hear me out. What the fuck was Krakoa doing from 1975 to 2018, with the exception of 3 or 4 appearances there? These things should have randomly happened on Krakoa, been forgotten when they left Krakoa, and the Hoxpox era has them remember. There was no benefit to it being in a cornfield in 1 and 2. I don't actually think New York raised the stakes in 3 and 4 because nothing about the city ever mattered. They didn't interact with buildings or people. It was all about the ship. Here, the fact that it was vaguely racist by putting it in Latveria was problematic. Why not have it be a settlement on Krakoa that is threatening the indigenous people, so a 90s environmentalist group rose up? You could have had these things come due because of the magic of Krakoa instead of having us forget. It's so boring to tell me your idea is so good I should forget it.
I disagree. I appreciate
the Men in Black neuralizer at the end of every even numbered issue.
Sure.
The reason I think Krakoa is so brilliant and this whole Krakoan era is because it was kind of the forgotten storyline. Like Krakoa, the Living Island, was such a kind of ridiculous and audacious storyline when it first happened in Giant Size. And nobody ever picked up that thread again, except for, I guess, like when you get the baby Krakoa that was like living in the mansion.
Well,
like
and there was
actually the lawn for a while. Don't forget when it was the lawn.
Right. Yeah.
There actually was a backstory for Krakoa that Hickman said, I just need you to ignore, even though it happened in 2016.
Like a lawn.
So
they actually did do like a Krakoa backstory in 2016 and explained how it actually connected to the Howling Commandos. And it was a thing called Journey into Mystery, the mystery of Krakoa. And it just got thrown out in 2018 for Hickman. So it actually had been explored. They just ignored it.
Yeah, so I don't want to see like the forgotten X Factor mission when the team went to Krakoa. Like straight up. I don't want us to like muck with Krakoa's past. I'm more concerned with Krakoa's present and the future. So I agree with Josh. Like it would have been nice to see some relevant plot threads tied up. But I think that, there's a third rail there that you don't want to grab because it can't be too consequential because then it knocks the timeline off, right? Like you can't.
Like no one used Rhapsody and Random for 30 years. Like give me an awesome Rhapsody Random story
100%
doesn't fuck anything up because no one touched them.
Yeah.
1 through 4 had Cyclops, 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 had Havoc. 7 and 8 have Wolverine. This was the most creative lineups.
And that's part of the problem is that when you make it revolve around Summers Brothers and Wolverine with the incredibly complicated and convoluted chronologies that those characters have over so many years and so many writers, it's very difficult to do anything without butterfly affecting. Like you can go, I think this series would be better served focusing on those lost characters from those times as opposed to major characters from those times. Because the people that you're appealing to who love those runs, that's what we miss the most anyway.
I
Like
want
the
Gaia
people who
from
are
Gen
like,
X.
I miss 90s X Factor. I miss this. I miss that. Well, we've been getting fucking Cyclops and Wolverine. Like, it's not like I haven't had any Cyclops since X Factor 58. Like,
Right.
no, but you know what I haven't had a lot of is Random and Adam X. Adam X. That's why we fucking wanted the first 2 issues. Adam X.
And then he
We
was a
wanted
side
Adam
character
X.
in it.
Yeah, I agree. Having these little mutant freedom fighters or whatever that nobody knew, nobody cared about is absolutely a missed opportunity. You're right about that. Like, honestly, part of me would have loved to see another session with Doc Samson when he was, the team psychologist.
Great call.
Like, that could have been fun. But then I even as I'm saying that, I'm like, you know what though, that was such a good tight little story. Like, maybe that's just best left as is. Like, don't try to reinvent it and fuck it up. So, I'm of mixed minds with it, but I agree. I could have used some more nostalgic pulls rather than these characters that we have never seen and will never see again.
And I
The
feel like
interesting thing will be if anybody starts in present day Krakoa starts bringing back these characters that have now been seeded in the past.
And I think he actually did kind of reinvent the device, because you're right. I when you said Doc Samson, I was like, oh yeah, bring me Doc Samson. And you were like, but better that he didn't sully it. And I was like, okay, fair point. And then you said, better he didn't reinvent it. Well, he kind of did. This trial kind of back and forth kind of gave me classic X Factor vibes.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
X-Men Legends 5 and 6 see the X Factor team giving a deposition about an investigation that they were sent out to that they frankly kind of botched out in Latveria, involving Doom experimenting on some potentially latent mutants and giving them powers, fucking them up, them wanting revenge. It's very 1992 in that regard. And that's really the whole plot.
The narrative style does fit with, it's something Peter David used a couple times in that era and on that run, which also adds to the kind of nostalgia feel, which I liked.
Flag on the field, this actually takes place at the Latverian embassy, not in Latveria.
Totally true.
So
which is why the United Nations had to get involved, and why we got a really cool, I was a big fan of, and I'm usually not a big Pietro fan, and I don't think Peter David's Pietro is necessarily the best Pietro either. Maybe 90s way better than 2000.
I love.
I'm thinking of 2000s.
2000s, the best
X Factor Investigations Pietro was a bag of shit, but 90s Pietro did have some good stuff.
I like bitchy Pietro over petulant Pietro.
But I loved the blasting the Fantastic Four and the X-Men for their politicization and handing the bat. Like,
and the Avengers.
The Pietro explanation on that was really good. And, because of the way we never learn from our geopolitical mistakes in the real world, and so we continue making them over and over and over and over again. See Afghanistan in the 1980s, see Afghanistan in the 1990s, see Afghanistan in the 2000s, see Afghanistan in the 2010s, see Afghanistan fucking today.
See Afghanistan run Afghanistan run.
You can make something like this that plays to like what it was like in the 90s and relevant statement on what it's like today, because it's the fucking same.
So speaking of the fucking same, so originally we were going to do this 5 and then do this 6, and then we said 5 and 6 kind of go together so good, no reason to split them up. And I'm so glad that we did, Josh. That was such a great call on your part, and I'm so glad we were able to make this work out, because I'm haunted by the comparisons between X-Men Legends 5-6 and X Factor 10. There are a number of fascinating parallels, I feel, between the two stories. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting is I maybe had never noticed that there is such a fine speck of distance. Like when Sublime Beast said, "Did you think you'd live forever, you little speck?" Like that level of speck of difference between Pietro and Doom. I guess I just had never seen how close their mentality was, and the differences between North Star in Leah Williams and David Baldion's beautiful X Factor so outshines the petulant narcissism of Quicksilver when underserved. Now, this was good Quicksilver. I actually really enjoyed this particular Quicksilver, but it made me think of bad Quicksilver. And
David Baldeón is a good comp for Todd Knock too as an artist. I would put Todd Knock. We had compared David Baldeón when we were talking about the Dodsons, Terry and Rachel Dodson, in our Xi4P interview. We had compared that to artists like Humberto Ramos and David Baldeón, and I think that Todd Knock is like a blend of the kind of cartoony styles and also does what all three of those artists do really well, which is to make characters beautiful or beautiful even in nakedness without feeling like exploited or dirty, because look at this big, beautiful man.
There is a vulnerability to that roid monster as a guy who's like, oh, look at that beautiful roid monster. When guys are like, that guy's gains are suspicious, I'm like, good for him, right? So as a guy who appreciates that, the subtle, delicate beauty of how he captured Guido there is a testament to subtly sexualizing in a beautiful way men too, in a way we didn't used to get.
And this writer-artist pair do have a history. They did a long run on DC's Young Justice together. We're also talking about a writer who has, an artist who has worked for this writer and a writer who has scripted for this artist before, giving you, it's not a new pairing of, here's a new artist for this, that'll complement like we saw with Nicieza and Booth. This is, someone you worked with on another line, on another story, but who would fit and complement this story nicely. And so you get to bring that working relationship over.
I love that. So
they work well together, like Guido and Madrox, which to me were kind of like the stars, at least of the first issue. Like we're talking about stories and deep character pulls or whatever, but there's another part of the allure of this whole X-Men Legends title that's just like, give me some of that good old shit. And like watching Madrox multiply to climb over a force field was great. Watching Guido fighting through, mystic hellfire or whatever, and just absorbing the shit out of it, and then being the strong big tough guy, but also it hurt.
Guido,
like those moments to me were just like, oh, that's like
Peter David's Guido is always the skipper to Madrox's Gilligan, and it's perfect.
I love that. And speaking of people that represent specific dualities, dyads in the X-Force, if we will, that was just for you, Josh. I want to touch on the fact that in another parallel between X Factor and this story, one of the things that defined Leah Williams' run on X Factor, especially at the end, was the ghosts of the past and seeing your death. Aurora, was able to understand her death. I mean, it ultimately turned out that she killed herself to prove a point, but whatever. And David was killed and investigated his death. But we saw both of their deaths, both of the things that haunt them, that propel them forward. Now, here we saw it in the form of a mutant psychically manipulating people, but Polaris and Rain were both confronted with kind of specters of their trauma that propels them forward. I am so fucking bothered that I feel like Rain is in the exact same place right now in comics, whereas I feel like Polaris under Leah Williams and Dugan and Hickman and all of these expert pencil and pen teams that are coming together to set her free, I feel like this Lorna is of the past, but I am haunted 100%. By how stunted Rain is.
We have talked about this with Rain before. If Rain is not poorly served by a story, she isn't served at all.
I'm not even going to get into the Rain of it all, because Rain is just the worst, and it's through no fault necessarily of her own. Like, she's got these moments that she's sweet and endearing, but yes, she's constantly underserved. But I couldn't agree with you more, Nico, that this Polaris is stripped of all of the development and all all her growth. And we go back to, again, a Polaris who was underserved by a writer. And, when she doesn't have, she can't free Rain because, well, she's held by ropes and tied to wood. So I can't do anything. Like, It's
I
just
thought you
like
meant she
not
can't
the
have free reign. Not like she couldn't free reign. I
he
got so
couldn't free reign.
confused.
Yeah. I'm jumping ahead a little, but he, ultimately,
Well,
eventually, Rain
and
gets captured by the freedom fighters, and I keep calling them that, and I hope that's not, an offensive term. I'm just, oh, you know what? I'll call them the Latvian Liberation Front, like Havoc suggested. I think that's good. The LLF. Uh,
and
but like Polaris nowadays could raise the whole building if she has to. Like,
but it's also
his
fair
brain is
too.
like,
Like
oh, I can't do it.
if you had gone back and written the Polaris from Jerry Duggan's X-Men #2 into
Right.
this
Oh, it would
issue,
have been awful.
it
Awful.
would have not, like, this is a
wouldn't work.
Polaris at this point in the comics is, going and looking at, like, passing by jewelry stores in New York and wondering when Alex is going to propose. And this is the Polaris who spent the last 5 fucking years being under someone's mind control, whether it was Malice or the Shadow King, like,
Yep.
from one fucking fire into another. And I mean, she's not going to really start gaining that kind of step up autonomy until the Onslaught era. Like, until, like, we're not really even gonna see her. We've got a good 50 issues in this before we see her, like, break free. It's when Havoc becomes mind controlled by Dark Beast and shit that we even really start seeing her, like,
As a leader.
stop looking at herself as, like, a second to whatever he says. Like, waiting for Havoc to make the call on things. So,
well, and one I'm very grateful that there's one beat we did not revisit in this, and that would be Lorna's eating disorder and like body dysmorphia, which comes up back then. And I recognize that that's like a part of her history, and I think that's an interesting thing. And I think it'd be interesting if another writer, preferably a woman, eventually kind of revisits that with Lorna, possibly. But I'm really happy that we didn't have to see Peter David's, fresh 2021 take on Lorna's eating disorder from the 90s, because that is just sounds like a recipe
while we're
for a disaster.
Lorna, I watched the final 4 episodes of Wolverine and the X-Men last night with my boys. We've been working through it on Disney Plus.
That is the best
so good
run of episodes, with the exception of that Hulk episode earlier on. If you could just throw that in there.
No, it's the
Can
best.
I tell you
animated,
that Lorna, future Lorna showing up in the dystopian future and laying waste to an army of Sentinels
So good.
How is it that Lorna, who had been around since the fucking Silver Age, that gets her best fucking moment in a cartoon before she ever gets it in the comics?
Well, and I think that has to do with the idea of something on the page.
Wolverine and the X-Men.
Oh, for sure.
50 years in the comics, and the cartoon served her fucking better than the comics ever had when that episode dropped.
Well,
I'm
it's
just
like
putting it out there. If you guys want to do a Splinter pod all about Wolverine and the X-Men, count me in. We could go through it
see if we
episode by episode. There's a limited amount.
We'll see if we can keep up with our comic demand right now, because we can't even seem to talk about X-Men Legends 5 and 6. So, but the other thing about, I think,
okay, but in our defense, the more interesting thing to talk about these comics is the shit outside of them than, unfortunately, the shit inside of them.
Well, and that's
the outside of this story surrounding shit meta commentary is far more interesting than what we actually got on these 40 pages.
Oh, for certain. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about that is the way a number of these characters are still central. We still see Rain struggling with child-based traumas in the form of her missing child and her, it would appear, abusive husband in some ways. He really did kind of play mind games with her, kind of like Reverend Craig. So, it's still, she's the victim of men. And now there's men who won't let her have her child back. So Rain's sort of still in the same place. Alex is still damaged at not being Scott over in the pages of Hellions. We have Lorna finally coming due on herself. But I think the person who I can kind of draw the directest line from who they are here to their growth is Multiple Man. I feel like X-Corps' Multiple Man pays off the promise of X Factor Investigation Multiple Man in a way that propels the character forward. I can see Howard's multiple man in Peter David's multiple man in sort of a direct line way. I feel like this book really is finally kind of writing characters that feel like they matter to the present, because that X Factor story kind of meant nothing. Not in a bad way. It's my favorite of the 6, but it kind of meant nothing. How do you guys feel about the other characters like Alex, who is so damaged, or Jamie, as they appear currently in relation to why this story was vital now?
I want to say one thing about Lorna that I think made this a vital and important story. So, I guess it's in the second issue of this. When Lorna comes across whichever of the Latverian Liberation Front that creates the ghosts, and she comes across her mom, and her mom is blaming Lorna for the plane wreck, and specifically saying, Lorna, you killed. Oh, she says you killed me, child. I'm sorry. Can we just edit this all out? I thought she was going to say you killed my child, meaning that Lorna Dane's mom was pregnant during the plane crash, which was going to tie me back to the whole conspiracy theory about Zaladane and Lorna Dane's sister, and like, let's bring back Zaladane.
No, this
But
ties in
I
very
missed the comma.
specifically with the retcon from Peter David's X Factor investigations that went back and, yes, made it so Lorna's mom was having an affair with Magneto, and the dad got mad, and there was a fight on the plane. And then, Lorna kind of panicked and caused it to crash, but Magneto came in and rescued her and asked, was it Mastermind to mind wipe her of it so she didn't grow up with the trauma? Which did a good job of kind of. It was a nice, or Mesmero, one of the OG brother manipulators. And yeah, it did a good. I thought it was a really good take on that Peter David one of kind of the balance of 60s Magneto as like the human underneath, but he doesn't always show everyone because he wants to kind of puff his chest out as like, fuck you, I'll be the monster you think I am. Yeah, and obviously Peter David wrote that, and it's always nice when a writer doesn't forget what they wrote and contradict their own continuity. So
now,
that was a good tie to that. And before time, because he's writing this to have taken place before that.
Now, I do have a question about Doom, because I feel like, Josh, I know you know Doom better than me, by far. And, Arturo, I'm not sure your relationship with, Doom so much, but between Sword, which is an X title, Guardians of the Galaxy, where he's appearing regularly as a regular member of the team, which is tying into Sword because of Last Annihilation, and because of the Hellfire Gala, I have had a lot of Doom lately. Yeah, that guy who, in some realities has goat legs, for whatever reason.
To answer your question about my relation to Doom, again, time travel to the 80s, the Secret Wars toys, Dr. Doom was one of the coolest ones, hands down.
By far.
And I kid you, I mean, he doesn't have any of his paint on him or whatever, but that figure is still in a box like that I've given to my nephews, and that they don't even play with anymore, but it still exists. And so I always had like an affection for Doom. His just like aesthetic is awesome. I think
even a Delsto Corona Doom print inside. Doom was my my older boy's first comic love.
Yeah, Doom is just like one of the greatest villains. He's just, I think one thing Peter David missed the mark on here is like, I could have done with about 50% more Doom monologuing. Like, what is Doom if not a great orator? And we kind of got a watered down version of that. And
it would have played perfect with the impatient Pietro that he was with all the time, because Pietro has no fucking patience for that shit.
Nope.
I thought they were a good character block together. I really liked the way Doom and Pietro played in this.
But it
could have been even better. I
enjoyed we're fighting Doom. Psych, it's a Doom bot. And then, here's another Doom bot. No, it's actually Doom. Like,
And that's a little more 80s than 90s. Just about every fucking Doom appearance in the 80s goes like that. But
so how do you feel about the Doomclusion in X-Men? I like it because the X-Men are trying to step up their game. Now they're not just mutants, so they're not just kind of science-y, but they're magic, and there's mysterium, and there's dimension hopping. It kind of seems like the X-Men are trying to turn Krakoa into like their own Doom Island in a lot of ways. They really are touching on a lot of Doom's shit. And it makes me wonder if this is part of a bigger attempt to cement the X-Men and Doom a little bit closer, especially considering 2 years ago's X-Men Fantastic Four.
Well, that's something that I kind of expected coming into this because, the greatest writer of Doctor Doom in comics history is one Jonathan Ezekiel Hickman. So what he's done with that character throughout his Fantastic Four run, throughout his New Avengers, through Secret Wars, so this is a character that he loves very, very much. And he has fleshed out and made so, like, he's made us totally buy that, like, anything, whether you like it or not, anything that Slott's done with Doom in his run is only possible because of the Hickman run.
Okay.
Hickman gave us Uncle Doom. He is Uncle Doom forever because of that, and it totally buys and plays. And we, like, if you've read it all, you get it. Like, he loves that girl in a totally, like,
Genuine,
parental, okay, yeah. Yes,
it's not creepy.
Yes.
It's just just unsettling, but it's not creepy.
No, like, if Reed and Sue disappeared, like, he would, yes,
give me my babies.
He could go to him and he would take care of her and be okay. Yes.
I even think he'd take care of Franklin in an avuncular-ish way.
He doesn't have patience for Franklin's whininess. He loves the same way it eats away at his core of being every time Reed Richards says something that he didn't think of first. Doom is so fucking proud behind that mask every time Valeria says something he didn't think of first. He gets almost that grandfatherness of being able to, like, spoil and love because I don't have to put up with you all the time. Like, if you were my own child, he gets to be an uncle. Like, he is Uncle Doom and gets to have all the perks with none of the down, like, with her. And she's everything he would have wanted from a child, everything Kristoff never was. Like, the Doom Valeria relationship is fucking great. And it's given us more to him as a character. Like, so Doom showing up in X-Men was something I expected. I expected it to be more under the pen of Hickman, us getting more of a Hickman Doom. But I really like Doom kind of respecting Krakoa's autonomy in the way that he's always wanted other people to respect Latveria's autonomy. And I thought that it made, like, the X-Men Fantastic Four miniseries was, I wanted so much more. It could have been better. It did not serve characters the best, especially when it was a replay of the OG Fantastic Four X-Men miniseries.
The Dodsons just felt like their hearts weren't in it. Zardsky's characterization felt like he had three voices to pick from. It just felt rushed in a way that wasn't fair to anybody.
And we're at a point where if we're getting Kitty Franklin dynamic, so much of it should be based around Rachel Summers. The fact that one of them is her future husband and the other is her future wife. Like, I just, yeah, the encroaching on that, the need from James Robinson and now Dan Slott and now Chip Darsky to know no other thing to do with Sue other than just make her an angry turfy Karen. Like, I just, because I love Fantastic Four and I love X-Men. If you're going to give me a Fantastic Four X-Men story, you can't be making one of them miserable motherfuckers.
I agree. It needs to be a celebration of familial love. It shouldn't be I don't want to be reading X-Men Fantastic Four Osage County. That's not what I'm here for.
See, I guess I'm in the minority because I and we're not here to talk about X-Men and Fantastic Four, but like I kind of enjoyed that run. I thought it was imperfect to say the least, but I got what he was trying to put down. I understood, like, what he was saying, could you try to be less mutant kind of vibe. I know it wasn't I know it was very like triggering for some people, and I respect that, and I know it's not for everybody, but I got it. I got what he was trying to say, and I enjoyed it for what it was, but it did feel very rushed, and and I agree we could have used some Rachel Summers in there.
So I want to ask you guys a question about the future of this book, right? Before anything else, before, free for all final thoughts. The first trade is issues 1 through 6. We definitely know that they've solicited a 7/8 by Larry Hama featuring
Hammer time,
which I couldn't be more excited about. I mean, I'm doing the
Hammer
big
time.
baggy pants because his Wolverine is one of my favorite, but I do think there's a danger in this series that I hadn't considered till I thought about Hama coming back on to do more Wolverine. Hama is still writing the characters from his original run now. During a recent crossover, the Iron Man event where everything got super Iron Man-y, Iron Man 2020, he wrote LCD. And,
right, he did I Wolverine.
Right, so he's still doing traces of his original run now.
Is it any different than Peter David's Maestro, Pax Romano, whatever the like?
Exactly. And Nicieza just did another Infinite online only Marvel Comics exclusive Cable Deadpool online 2 years ago. So he's even still touching on the same X-Force threads through Deadpool. If they just put 1 through 6 in a trade, then there's definitely going to be at least a 9-10 for a second trade. They would never leave 2 issues uncollected. They would never collect just 2 issues. So I've got to assume there is at least plans.
I would love a 2-issue prestige tied double, like $12.99, whatever. Like, why?
I'm with you. I actually loved when they would do the
with scripts and commentary
and like the 84-page floppies. Like, I think you should really go back to like those 108-page monsters, Marvel. Push them to the max, right?
But I found a Reign of Terror at an LCS recently. And so it's a big store here in Central Florida that has, speaking of Reign either being not served or underserved in stories.
And of course,
they have a dollar room. They have a dollar back issue room. And they also have an old trade section where old trades are essentially discounted because their cover price with prices not adjusted for inflation. And so, you can find some cool old trades there for whatever, like $9.99, $11.99, like, because they're just cover price. And so I picked up Reign of Terror expecting to pay the cover price of $5.99. And I brought it up to the counter and the guy rang it up as $1 as if it was from the dollar room. And so I was like, I pulled this from the old trade section. This wasn't a dollar room book. And he looked at it and he's like, this isn't worth $5.95.
No, and it has.
And I couldn't argue with him.
No, of course not.
You're not wrong. Thank you.
Marvel really wanted to do those prestige style Vertigos.
That would be perfect for these. Like Reign of Terror type size style, like, would be perfect for these complete stories.
The Marvel must-haves that they did for a few years, where if a book sold out too fast and digital hadn't picked up just yet, they would do NYX 1 through 3 in a single issue for $4.99. Then they did NYX 4-5 in a single issue for $4.99. Then they did Runaways 1 through 3 in a single issue for $4.99. And these were to help people catch up before the first trade came out. And I thought it was a cute idea. But where do you think this series might even go? We've touched on sort of generic 90s X-Men. We touched on specifically Wheezy's X Factor. Now we've gone to Pad's X Factor. We're heading to Wolverine. What classic runs do you think we might see a return to? I'd love to see more X-Men from the 90s that maybe didn't get as much love. Some John Francis Moore X-Force, some Generation X, maybe around the Ferber years would be
Ferber Gen X is one of my bigs.
Right? What else do you guys want to see happen?
Cable would definitely be one of them. Cable with
Yeah.
Baby Hope from because I don't remember how to pronounce his name off the top of my head without looking at it.
I unfortunately won a lot of runs that nobody should ever go back to for creative staff
Exactly. That's
reasons.
I think that right there
And
is
that's the
like
big
is
thing.
like
So many
the
of these people
minefield of this. Like there's certain storylines and stuff that like it'd be fun to, you know, revisit and get a little more Conan, Revanche, Psylocke, but like do we want to go back and get, I think was that
And
Lobdell?
like,
Like I don't
Lobdell.
want
if you're
to
talking
I
about
don't want to see a
Generation
Lobdell
X,
book. I don't want to
the
see a
biggest
Lobdell book. I
answer-
don't want to see a Rob Liefeld book, which I know would be kind of like, oh well, this was that era. Like I don't want to see it.
The
I
Jeff
just
Loeb
and that's
book.
the thing is the biggest
It's
answer for these
tricky.
is like, if we do Alpha Flight, it should be John Byrne. We're fucking doing John Byrne. If we do Gen X, like who wouldn't love a Lobdell, Chris Bacalo Gen X?
Yes.
But we can't do Lobdell. Like,
I would
like,
love to see Gen X though. Like that, I gotta say, like, yeah, I love it.
How about Siegel? Was it Siegel and Joe Mad with the Maro Celia Reyes Maggot? Steven Siegel. X-Men from who was that? Joe Mad on the art in those from the adjective list.
God, bring Joe
More
Mad
in
back.
70s post OZ T.
Anything to get more in these. If I could get more from the incredible era that was Uncanny 351 to 359 and X-Men 70 to 79, I'd be thrilled.
X-Men 70 to 79, right? That was Siegel, and was it Joe Mad on art?
Let's check. So for X-Men 70
Uncanny
to
was
79, we have Joe Kelly and Jorge Gonzalez with Bill Roseman
Kelly
and Joe
was the writer.
Casey, with art by Pacheco, Johnson, Garcia, Brome, and Lopresti. And then
Right.
on the
Siegel had picked up Uncanny on
Yeah.
351. Siegel was the
For-
Uncanny side. Kelly was the adjectiveless side. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Joe Kelly X-Men run from the adjectiveless 70s.
it had
I got one. Let's go back to Grant Morrison. I would love to see what they did. You know what they would do with like 2 or 3 issues of X-Men Legends. Like,
wouldn't we all?
and like where would you know, plug that in? Like, would we get more of like Here Comes Tomorrow and like the future? You know, that timeline that could be awesome. Like, I would love to see a little more Grant Morrison.
According to Grant, the story was going to switch teams very slightly. They were going to pick up on Polaris's inclusion in the New World storyline, and the story was going to continue forward, sans Jean plus Lorna. So that's what would have happened according to Morrison.
Give it to me. Yes, give me that.
But I mean, that would be a what if story. Like that would be a couldn't it have happened? Not that it did happen.
That's your new X-Men forever, not
Yeah. And that makes it so tricky.
Nico.
That's me.
What about De Filippi and Weir?
Okay. Like don't even fuck with me on that, because if we
That's
could go
you.
back, that
That's
so gets
you.
me. If we could go back to New X-Men Academy X and all of those little soap opera kids,
Oh, yes.
it was like Mutant Melrose Place. And
Yes.
those kids, like I understand so many people having a passionate, affectionate, mad on for Kyle and Yost. I
Talk
get
about
it.
someone who had plans that were being threaded and never got to go to fulfillment, and can
Ever.
tie up things and cover like that he didn't get to in the past. Like that is a perfect fit for this series.
And they
Yeah.
were a married couple. Hopefully they're still married and they can do it together. And, you know, bring in a LaRocca or a Lopresti or somebody still from that era, still kind of working. I think the only thing is I definitely don't want to see Claremont on this book ever. I feel like putting Claremont on this book would immediately overshadow anyone else's contributions inherently, because now Granddad came on, everybody else is getting an ass whooping. It just feels a little too big to ever let Claremont have his hands on this. He should just get his own thing, like always.
You know what? Like, I'll disagree with that. Like, if you give me Claremont, like, I would love to see him do something just totally off the beaten path. Give me,
Okay.
you know, 2 or 3 issues of strictly in the Morlock tunnels,
Ooh.
character development, just something that like could have happened. We never had visibility to it.
Okay.
but that could be interesting,
The
something
problem
from
too
like
is
a
that
time
he's already
capsule
been
kind of
given
thing.
he's been given so many opportunities to go back and do this
Yeah.
already that like if he hadn't done X-Men Forever, this would make more sense for him.
Right. I just pulled a Madeline and I broke my Havoc.
Oh, you know what I
Oh,
heard about the
no.
other day that would actually be perfect if Claremont was going to do this? Originally, there had been a Rachel Gray miniseries that
Oh
was
yeah.
planned post Wolverine killing her in Uncanny and before Mojo Mayhem. That was supposed to be the bridge from when you see her in like Spiral's workshop there.
To when you
And
see her
they
at
had even
Excalibur.
like started drawing it
Oh,
and it was
yes.
working and they just didn't like if he was to go back and tell the Rachel in between Uncanny and Mojo Mayhem, that would be a great 2 issues Claremont here that would tie in and be a perfect fit for him.
Two things. I would love to see anything Mojo World. That could be kind of cool. Like give me basically like a long shot, one shot. Oh my god, that shirt is beautiful.
I love that
Spiral's the
multi-armed
best.
interpretation of Strife you're wearing. They
Like
have
that-
similar
like that,
helmets.
I
would
would
be so good
I
at
would
carpentry.
straight up kill for that. Just long shot, Spiral, Mojo 2, the sequel. Like, yeah, that sounds like
All the
a
major
really good
domos.
time. All the major domos. Yeah, that sounds really fun. God, what was the other? Oh, here's something. Give me a Sage specific story. Sage when she was a background character at the Hellfire Club.
For sure.
Give me a whole fucking thing of Sage like infiltrating and sabotaging some Sebastian Shaw plot or something. Like give me more Sage, because one thing that Claremont did beautifully with Extreme X-Men, which I know is hit or miss, was Sage. Like he
100%.
made Sage
Love it.
one of the coolest characters, and I can never have enough Sage. So Sage, Spiral, Longshot, all of these sound like good Claremontian options.
And I even want to comment that it falls into my Wolverine camp. Number one, there's this big thing that they never actually specified until I think it was like the 2000s that Batman's parents were shot at the opera. Prior to that, it was just the theater, and most
It was a
depiction-
movie theater.
Yeah,
They were
it was
going
usually
to
a
Zorro,
movie
we all
theater.
know that. And
Zorro.
now that we are 20 some years since, it is the Antonio Banderas Zorro. That is new canon now. They were going to see the Antonio Banderas Zorro based on how bad time has been to us.
I
killed Arturo.
hate that.
Arturo's dead.
That's for real? Are you for real? Are you just like, are you being clever, or is that serious?
Well, no, like people like to joke all the time about how like if Batman's about this old and this happened when he was
Right.
this age, that like these would have been like the movies he probably went to see. And one of the more common ones the last couple of years has been like he probably went to see Space Jam. But Mask of Zorro came out, what was it, 97 or 99 or something, like late, like we're at the point where, because it used to be Zorro, because young Bruce Wayne was a huge Zorro fan, and it was someone even did it, maybe it was the animated series or someone did a thing though where they were like going to see Zorro because it was like old black and white Zorro. And now it would be Antonio Banderas Zorro.
Okay, so
that would have
drives
been the
me-
movie his dad was taking him, little Thomas Wayne was taking Bruce Wayne to see on the night that they were killed.
This drives me insane when people like focus in on the sliding timeline or the sliding time scale. It gives me a fucking aneurysm, because in Marvel, we're in Earth 616. So I think you gotta kind of compress time a little differently and accept that no, this isn't our Earth, real Earth's history. You know what I mean? So I get it, but like it drives me insane. Like some things you just kind of not worry about it and just
Batman grew up watching Antonio Banderas as Zorro.
So I bring up Batman because we know his origin at the start, right? So we know that Batman got his powers from brooding, right? And he's always, very Phantom of the Opera. And so Wolverine, all we knew was he had stupid hair. And then they go in and they give us, and what I do is so incredibly pretty in the pages of Wolverine Origin, and then Origin 2 and Origins. The payoff of the things we always vaguely knew about Wolverine were really disappointing. I am not an Origin fan, having nothing to do with anything, but it becomes River Song. Obviously, she was the doctor's wife.
You mean Melody Pond?
Right? I mean, like, obviously, there were just so many things where River Song, Melody Pond, body of water music, body of water music. Like, you couldn't make it interesting because we knew the ending due to choreography. How many stories are there left that have been hinted at or nudged toward? Like, we went into the third Summers Brothers story being like, they're going to conclude the third Summers Brothers story. It's over. What is there left to tell? What are we hankering for? We came up with a list of things we're interested in, but what out there in X canon isn't Wolverine's backstory? What isn't
I mean, there's
going to be a
early questionable Gambit because they shy away from Gambit doing bad things, but like we have not. It's been danced around a lot, but like we have not gotten good like the type of Gambit that would take the job with the Marauders.
We need Gambit
would be
Max.
cool.
Like
That would
Gambit
be really cool.
is he
Glad
not
Claremont's
just the head of
getting
the Thieves Guild, he the head of the Assassin Guild too.
Yeah.
So
I did it in the voice because I wanted to say Thieves.
Thieves.
and see, I was just being.
Thieves
I said I'm glad
Guild.
Claremont's getting him.
I will
because,
say
you
one
know,
thing.
Guild.
One thing I do not want to see, and speaking of Wolverine's backstory, is anything to do with Romulus. I reject the whole freaking Romulus storyline. Like, Weapon X was a very compelling backstory, and all the memory wipes give you a lot of leeway to go back and tell great stories or whatever. The Romulus plotline is, like, in my opinion, better left forgotten. It's almost like, Nightcrawler's Draco. Like, I didn't need that. I don't want that.
It comes
and
back
I
to this
choose
in
to
terms
ignore
of,
it. There's stories that I just, I don't like that. Throw it in the
and
trash.
this is what
bin.
we said earlier, and is one of the things that is kind of hurting this book right now is that we're focusing on Wolverine and Summers Brothers,
Yeah.
and those are too convoluted as it is. We need like this title would be much better off focusing on underserved characters. Like if it did stories focusing on Gambit backstory and Rachel backstory, and like if you went in on these characters, like, you know what? How about Shan in Vietnam? Like we could go to places with this that have not been delved into and serve those characters with old creative teams in ways that, like, none of us are like, God, I can't believe I haven't gotten any Wolverine stories lately. Like,
right.
serve us with the characters that we've been missing. Like, give us more Maggot, give us more Amara, give us, there is so much time. All of those characters, Random, Boom Boom, Amara. How about in between when they just fell off the board, and then when a lot of them showed up, like fucking homeless people living on Utopia, like after the X-Men had abandoned it. Like, there's tons of underserved gaps that could give us compelling stories previously with old creative teams on characters that were neglected.
Oh yeah.
It does not need to be the Summers Brothers, not a retcon book.
I got a request. Give me Black Tom, Juggernaut, Pyro, and Avalanche double date. Crime spree / double date. Like,
Yeah.
give me some old school, like, give me, give me some of, like, give me a Freedom Force story, for Christ's sake. Like, just a fun, like, that time that Freedom Force got deployed to do some underhanded, crooked shit.
When Mystique and Spiral were on a team together.
And I think the concern is that we're saying, oh, we have all these great stories that we could tell. This book was pitched as the stories they never got to tell. This book was pitched.
We're here because they're not doing that.
But I feel like Marvel would have a hard time justifying it. Oh, Peter David's been sitting on this 2-part random story for 30 years. That's not the byline they can sell to investors, even though it's the byline that makes sense to us. I still think this book should just be digital exclusive weekly and deal with it. I just think make it a digital exclusive weekly and deal with it. I don't think
and then it comes out in trade. Then it comes out in trade eventually. Digital exclusive to 6 months later in trade.
Exactly. I just don't know that I see too much more of a future on this book. I enjoyed the first two. I enjoyed the second two. I enjoyed the third two, but I can definitely say, having been on all 6 issues of this book, that I can say for certain, I like talking about it with you guys more than I like the book. I like the
and that's what we said
controversy it
earlier. The
stirs.
outside is more interesting than the inside.
Yeah. I like the loud banter that it makes us argue about things, because new things get you passionate. Old things keep you angry. It's hard to talk about new things without getting like, but you're a fuckhead. You know what I mean? Like, so you watch you go back to the old stuff and you can be like, but I think you're an asshole. And like, you can be different about it. Outside of fandom stoking, I think my result on X-Men Legends 1 through 6 after a trade's worth is kind of meh, but I'm glad I bought it. Are you guys going to keep buying it?
I mean, yeah.
The first,
I probably will.
It's marketed to us. It could be more. It's disappointing because it's underserving.
Well, and I think part of it is like the guardrails I mentioned earlier, where the creators have this premise of, okay, you can kind of wedge this story in between issues, you take your pick, and there's only so much you can do, so because there's not going to be a lot of consequences. So every story so far doesn't really feel like an exciting roller coaster that you don't know what's going to happen next. It feels a little more like it's a small world after all, where you're just kind of like going through and, you know, admiring the art and, you know, enjoying the monotonous music, and just, you know, it's a nice little ride, but it's not a thrill, you know. It's not bad, is my
I do have some questions
hot
about
take.
this issue, and there is something that I think this series could become for us. So we had 4 mutants that we'd never seen before in here, who I am not like, these aren't Arab names. If these were Arab names, I feel like I would have so much to say, because
No, they're all pagan. They're all pagan holidays. They're all based on Wiccan and pagan holidays.
Fairly certain. Yes. Yeah. There's some
Imbolc and Samhain.
Yeah, they said like the witch's Sabbath.
Not lasagna. I kept wanting to like read it as lasagna.
As a guy who's these are my holidays.
Lufthansa?
These are the names of my holidays. So like, I recognize them immediately.
Can you say them for me?
If I can open it, yeah. I got to look at stuff. But where are the names? Because I want to say everything right, because it's one of those things, you know, people just don't ask you about being
it's on the page where they green fire burn the Doombot.
So you have Kevo could do it so much better than me. You have I feel like it's usually pronounced Sam, but I usually say Samhain. We have Imbolc, we have Lunasa, right? And we have Beltane.
Okay.
Or Beltane.
I always read the GH in the Arab way of the Gha. So like, and I know that they're, you know, I'm not Eastern European bloc names are not my, so I'm not familiar with the background on these. But so we have those, and then they are presumably murder killed at the end by Doom.
Yeah.
Do we feel that, so first, part A, we could see these characters resurrected on Krakoa in the future? And B, how do we feel about having character resurrections on Krakoa who could then have their backstories filled in and placed in time with older series where we get their deaths in X-Men Legends?
I have
a
short answer to the first part and a short answer to the second part. Pretend for a minute I'm new writer, Mikey new writer, and I have an opportunity to write Marauders. I'm going to create my own characters that if get used in a movie, I'm going to get more attention for than do a really cool take on obscure Peter David characters. So I don't feel a pull toward these poorly defined characters where I would want to write them. I would create more fleshed out, less possibly racially and religiously encroaching insensitive versions. As far as bring them back, I bet they might just use this to be like Doom executes mutants. He's a bad guy. Like they could reference this more than I think they'd bring these guys back.
Yeah.
There's just not
Yeah,
a reason to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think
They're
the
not compelling
potential, I think the potential is there
Yeah.
for somebody to successfully do that. Like again, like give me a Morlock one shot, make a compelling character, and then resurrect them on Krakoa. I'm into it. Like, sure. But I think the smarter move is grabbing obscure pull. Like you were right, we were right the first time. Rhapsody, right? Like give me a character that was there that we did not get enough of, and then give us a little more, with them. So
And let's go other way with
could
it.
you introduce a new character and bring them back?
The
Absolutely.
X-Men
but, like, it wouldn't be
Legends.
these guys.
The Legends have been writers with more modern artists for the most part.
Yeah.
What if we flip that and it becomes art legends with new writers, right?
Like a
So we
Sienkiewicz
catch
working with
Leah
Vita.
Williams. Leah Williams gives
Ooh.
us a character resurrection. And then we go back and find out how they died in a New Mutants comic taking place between 27 and 28 with art by Bill Sienkiewicz, written by Leah Williams, where they meet this character and this character dies and now they're resurrected in a new Leah Williams book. Like, what if
I
it's
like that
new
as a
writer?
different project. That's not
It
a
is a
story
different
that he never
project.
got to tell.
It's not.
So I like that a lot. I love
But
that.
this isn't either. Peter David hasn't been sitting on this story for 30 years.
I've really wanted to offend some Latverians. Can I have the book? I'm not watching Once Upon a Time today. That was my Peter David impression.
He loves Once Upon a Time.
He really does. It comes up a lot.
Mhm.
So guys,
He used to do a weekly, I guess monthly, because it wasn't a weekly book, but in his later X Factor investigations, like a monthly update of like him and his daughter Caroline watching Once Upon a Time, like on the first page, like before the comic started.
I remember that. So guys, we are at time. I am calling it. X Factor, you ended at issue 90. We're ending you soon. Guys, final thoughts on X Factor number. Oh my God, I called it X Factor. Final thoughts on X Factor 75B and 75C.
75.1 and 75.2.
Yeah. Casada math.
Not 75.INH.
Or point AU, which I actually thought was really clever, that the Age of Ultron stuff was point AU because that's also alternate universe. So
Oh my
point
God,
AU
we're not going to talk about AU. I
so
hated
clever.
that. Ugh.
Now, okay.
Hated that whole thing.
Final thoughts.
Final thoughts on this. It happened. It wasn't bad. That's my hot take. I mean, like I think just in this, little brainstorm of an episode, like we've come up with some great potential storylines and possibilities with this premise of X-Men Legends. I think we've covered that the potential and the promise are not really meeting up with what could be happening. We're getting kind of some, this was a bit of a throwaway story. But there were some great panels, there was some great art, and it was not bad.
We didn't really get to go in the art. I like the art. I like the way stylistically it brings us back. And Nico really hit the nail on the head at the beginning of this with what an amazing job Rochelle Rosenberg did.
Yeah.
She was on so much X stuff pre-Krakoa, and to no fault of her own, like Marte Gracia just came in and was masterclassing with a color palette and style that is incredibly unique and now defines this new era.
Yeah.
So we don't have much use for the amazing talents of Rochelle Rosenberg in the Krakoan era right now,
which is a bummer.
But what she did here of hyper accenting the primary colors in a way that elicits that 90s style so much. Like this is so bold and colorful in a way that is not at all Krakoan.
Very flat, very unsaturated, except when neon. Like it's a really specific Pantone. It blew my mind. The greens are so horrifying and putrid, which was such a big 90s thing, really gross greens. And like, I mean that
that
lovingly.
ectoplasmic green.
Yeah, plasmic. Thank you. That's so much better than gross.
Yeah, she did a fantastic job on here, and I'm a big fan of her work. I always love when she gets to confuse us all by doing work with Matthew Rosenberg as well. But she did great color work. Give her props for what she did on Disassembled, which was a project that had a lot of different writers but one colorist to help tie it together. And I'm a big fan of the final product on that series, which was also hers. So big props to Rochelle Rosenberg on this.
I also think Todd Knock deserves, because the guy knows how to pencil into someone else's vision. I think it's unfair to say, because Rochelle and Todd were partnered together on the Nightcrawler book that came up earlier as well under Claremont, right? But I feel like Knock can step into another personality pretty well. And I feel like that's something he does really well on this book. And I really like the art probably the most.
Knock is really good at taking something that in other hands could have become questionably PG-13 and making it solidly enjoyably PG in a way that I would kind of say Humberto Ramos, like tying him with like artists like the Dodsons, Humberto Ramos and David Baldeón. In another artist would have made Clothes Blown Off be something completely different than what Knock did here. And I think there's a reason why he tends to be on more youth-oriented projects. It's a skill that he has. His Young Justice run was great and great for kids.
All right. If no one else has anything else, I'm going to call it on X-Men Legends, because this incredibly long episode ran legendarily long. And I want to thank you guys. And don't forget, you can always check out more amazing content here on YouTube at X's for Podcast with the Daily X. And until next time, guys, keep those mutant lights lit, those Krakoan gateways open, and we'll see you.
See you guys.
Hey guys, if you like that cut from X's for Podcast, you'll be sure to like some of our other materials. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out these other amazing videos here at X's for Podcast.